She was thrown into the river, but he rode through the storm to find her. Life in the farming villages outside Moulton moved at a slow and steady rhythm, shaped by the river, the seasons, and the habits of generations who had lived on the same land. At dawn, smoke rose from clay stoves as women prepared flatbread and tea. Men led buffalo and cattle toward the fields, their footsteps soft against the damp soil. Children hurried along dusty paths with slates tucked under their arms, laughing as they tried to outrun each other before lessons began. Among the villagers lived Aisha, a young woman known for her quiet nature and gentle voice. She lived with her widowed mother in a modest mud-brick house at the edge of the settlement, where the fields met the river plain. Their home was simple: a woven charpoy near the doorway, clay pots stacked neatly against the wall, and a small courtyard where her mother grew coriander and green chilies in broken clay containers. Aisha's days were filled with responsibility. She fetched water at sunrise, swept the courtyard, and helped her mother knead dough before the heat of the day settled over the land. In the afternoons, she taught village children beneath the shade of a neem tree. She showed them how to write their names, count numbers, and read simple sentences. Some families could not afford school supplies, so she used sticks to draw letters in the dirt. The children adored her patience. Even the most restless boys grew quiet when she spoke. Though she rarely sought attention, people respected her deeply. She listened more than she spoke, and when disputes arose between neighbors, her calm presence often softened tempers. If someone fell ill, she brought lentil soup. If a child cried, she wiped their tears. Her kindness did not draw praise from her own lips, but from the whispered gratitude of those she helped. The river was both the village's lifeline and its constant threat. It nourished crops, filled wells, and cooled the air during hot months. Yet everyone knew its moods could change without warning. During the monsoon season, elders watched its rising waters with wary eyes. They measured its height against tree trunks and stone markers set by ancestors who understood its power. For several days, dark clouds had gathered over the region. Rain fell in steady sheets, soaking fields and turning narrow paths into slippery tracks. At first, the villagers welcomed the rainfall. It promised a healthy crop and relief from dust-filled winds, but by the fourth day, the river swelled beyond its usual boundaries. Its muddy water rushed faster, carrying branches, reeds, and clumps of uprooted grass downstream. That afternoon, the air felt heavy and restless. Birds flew low across the fields, and livestock shifted uneasily. Aisha finished her lessons early and sent the children home before the next wave of rain arrived. She helped her mother secure sacks of grain and cover the firewood pile with an old plastic sheet. "Stay close tonight," her mother said, worry creasing her face. "The river sounds angry." Aisha nodded, though she had heard such warnings before. The river often roared during storms, yet it usually retreated by morning. Still, the wind carried a strange urgency that made her pause longer than usual before stepping outside. As dusk approached, the sky darkened into a deep gray. Thunder rolled across the horizon like distant drums. Villagers hurried to tie animals to higher posts and move tools under shelter. Doors were fastened. Lanterns flickered to life inside homes. Just before nightfall, a neighbor arrived breathless, asking Aisha's mother if Aisha could deliver medicine to an elderly woman who lived near the river path. The old woman suffered from fever, and the rain had prevented her son from returning with supplies from town. "I will go quickly and come back," Aisha said, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her mother hesitated. The wind had begun to howl, and the first heavy drops of a new downpour struck the ground. But compassion guided Aisha more strongly than fear. She tucked the small packet of tablets into her shawl and stepped into the storm. Rain fell hard, blurring the path ahead. The narrow trail to the riverbank was familiar to her feet even in darkness. Mud clung to her sandals, and gusts of wind pushed against her as though trying to turn her back. The river's roar grew louder as she approached. It sounded different tonight, deeper, more violent, as if the water itself were grinding against unseen obstacles. Lightning split the sky, revealing waves crashing against the banks where calm water usually flowed. She delivered the medicine and stayed only long enough to ensure the elderly woman swallowed the tablets. The old woman clasped her hand in gratitude, whispering blessings as thunder shook the walls. When Aisha stepped back outside, the storm had intensified. The path was nearly invisible beneath flowing water. She pulled her shawl tighter and began the return journey, placing each step carefully to avoid slipping. Somewhere behind her, a branch cracked loudly. She paused, heart pounding, and turned to look. But the rain blurred everything into shifting shadows. The wind whipped through tall grasses, creating movements that could be mistaken for figures. She told herself it was only the storm. As she neared the river bend, the ground felt softer beneath her feet. Water rushed across the path, tugging at her ankles. She tried to step onto firmer ground, but the current was stronger than she expected. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief burst of light, something startled her. A shape, a movement, a presence too close for comfort. Her foot slipped. The earth beneath her gave way, softened by days of rain. She grasped at reeds and wet soil, but her hands found no hold. Current seized her legs and pulled with sudden force. Cold water surged around her, swallowing her cry before it reached the wind. The river, swollen and relentless, carried her into darkness. Back in the village, doors rattled under the force of the storm. Aisha's mother waited anxiously, peering through the rain toward the path. Minutes stretched into an hour. The lantern flame flickered low. Neighbors gathered, calling her name into the night, their voices lost in thunder and rushing water. By midnight, the truth no one wanted to speak began to settle over the village like the storm clouds above. Aisha had not returned, and the river was still rising. The rain did not stop when the night ended. By morning, the sky remained a dull gray, and the swollen river continued to rush past the fields with a heavy, restless sound. Word of Aisha's disappearance spread from one mudhouse to another, carried in worried voices and whispered prayers. Men gathered near the riverbank, searching for signs along the muddy edges. Women stood in doorways, their shawls pulled tight, hoping for good news that did not come. Her mother had not slept. She sat on the charpoy near the entrance, staring toward the path as if her daughter might still appear, soaked and smiling, explaining that she had taken shelter somewhere safe. Neighbors tried to comfort her, bringing tea she did not drink and offering reassurances they did not fully believe. The storm had softened into a cold drizzle, but the river remained fierce and unpredictable. By midday, some villagers began to speak in quiet tones about the river's habits. They said it sometimes carried people far downstream before releasing them among reeds or shallow bends. Others shook their heads and warned that the current was too strong this time. No one wanted to speak with certainty. Hope and fear lived side by side in every heart. Nearly 20 kilometers away, along a rural road lined with acacia trees and flooded ditches, Hamza stopped at a roadside tea stall. He was a livestock trader who spent most of his days traveling between villages, buying and selling goats and cattle. His life followed the rhythm of markets and routes, and he was known for his honesty and calm manner. People trusted him with fair prices and straightforward dealings. The tea stall stood beside a narrow bridge where travelers often paused to rest. A torn plastic sheet flapped overhead as rainwater dripped from its corners. Inside, a small wood fire struggled to stay alive beneath a blackened kettle. Hamza wrapped his hands around a chipped glass of hot tea, grateful for its warmth. His clothes were damp from the journey, and mud clung to the hem of his shalwar. Two farmers sat nearby, speaking in low voices about the storm and the rising waters. "Did you hear?" one of them said. "A young woman from the villages near the river is missing." The other shook his head slowly. "They say the river took her last night." Hamza listened without intending to. Such news was sadly common during flood season, yet something in the man's tone carried unusual weight. "What was her name?" Hamza asked quietly. "Aisha," the farmer replied. "She taught children under the neem tree. Everyone knew her." The name stirred a memory. Months earlier, during a crowded livestock market, Hamza had witnessed a child fall and cut his arm on a sharp piece of metal. While others hesitated, a young woman stepped forward, cleaned the wound with water from her bottle, and wrapped it with a clean cloth torn from her own shawl. She spoke softly to calm the frightened boy. That woman had been Aisha. Hamza remembered her calm eyes and the way she reassured the child's mother that the injury would heal. She had not waited for thanks. She simply returned to her path and disappeared into the crowd. Now, hearing that she had vanished into the storm-filled river, he felt an unexpected heaviness settle in his chest. "What are they doing to search?" he asked. "They looked at dawn," the farmer said. "But the river is dangerous. No one can fight that current. If she was taken by the water, only fate knows where she may be." The men spoke with the quiet resignation of people who had seen the river claim lives before. They did not speak with cruelty, only acceptance of forces beyond human strength. Hamza stared into his tea, watching steam fade into the damp air. He tried to tell himself that this tragedy was not his burden. He had animals to deliver and routes to complete. Storm season was difficult for traders. Delays meant losses. Yet a persistent thought refused to leave him. Sometimes the river did not take, sometimes it carried. He had heard stories from fishermen and farmers who found survivors tangled in reeds miles downstream, alive only because branches or shallow mud slowed the current. These stories were rare, but they existed. The rain tapped softly against the plastic roof. Thunder rolled far in the distance, less fierce than the night before. Travelers resumed their journeys along the muddy road. Hamza finished his tea and stood, but instead of walking toward the market route, he remained beside his horse. The animal stamped its hoof, sensing his hesitation. He looked toward the direction of the river plains. "If there is even a small chance," he murmured to himself. The tea stall owner watched as Hamza tightened the saddle straps. "You are heading toward the floodplain?" the man asked. "The ground is dangerous today." "I know," Hamza replied. "No one can survive that river," the owner said gently. Hamza paused before answering. "Sometimes," he said, "people survive longer than we expect." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded with quiet respect. The road toward the river was nearly empty. Puddles reflected the gray sky, and water flowed across low sections of the path. Hamza urged his horse forward at a steady pace, careful to avoid deep mud that could trap the animal's hooves. As he traveled, signs of the storm's power became clearer. Broken branches lay scattered across fields. A small wooden cart had overturned in a ditch. In one village, men worked together to reinforce an embankment with sandbags and woven reeds. When Hamza stopped to ask about the river's condition, the answers were always the same: high, fast, dangerous. "Turn back if you value your life," one elder warned. But Hamza continued. The sky remained heavy, though the rain softened to a fine mist. Wind moved across the open plains, bending tall grasses in long waves. The sound of rushing water grew louder as he neared the floodplain. At the first settlement along the river, he dismounted to speak with fishermen repairing their nets beneath a slanted roof. "Have you seen anything carried by the current since last night?" he asked. One man shook his head. Another pointed downstream. "The current is strong. Anything taken may travel far. Sometimes the reeds catch what the water cannot carry." Reeds meant shallow bends. Shallow bends meant possibility. He thanked them and mounted again. The river came into view as a wide, churning ribbon of muddy water, far beyond its usual boundaries. Waves crashed against the banks, and uprooted plants spun in restless circles near the edges. Hamza guided his horse along higher ground parallel to the flow. He scanned the banks carefully, searching for any sign: fabric caught on branches, footprints in mud, broken reeds bent unnaturally. Time passed unnoticed. The drizzle chilled his hands, and exhaustion began to creep into his muscles. Doubt whispered that the search was hopeless, that the river's force was beyond any human effort. Yet he continued, calling her name into the wind, though he knew she could not hear him. As afternoon faded toward evening, he reached a narrow bend where the current slowed slightly before curving around a sandbar. The reeds here grew thick and tangled, forming natural traps for drifting debris. Hamza reined in his horse and listened. The river roared on, indifferent and relentless, but he did not turn back. Somewhere ahead, he believed, there was still a chance, small, fragile, but real. And he rode on through the fading light, refusing to surrender hope to the storm. The gray afternoon slowly faded into a dim, colorless evening. As Hamza continued along the river's edge, the air smelled of wet earth and crushed grass, and a cold wind moved across the floodplain in restless waves. Oh, his clothes were damp, his hands numb from the chill, yet he kept his eyes fixed on the shifting line where muddy water met the soaked land. The river no longer looked like the calm, life-giving stream villagers depended on. It was wide and wild, its surface churning with restless currents that twisted around fallen branches and uprooted plants. Every few moments something drifted past: a broken wooden plank, a cluster of reeds, a torn piece of cloth, or a tangled mass of weeds. Each time he saw movement, his heart lifted with hope, only to sink again when it proved to be nothing. Mud clung to its hooves, making every step slow and deliberate. Hamza leaned forward and patted its neck, speaking softly to reassure the animal. The sound of his own voice helped steady his thoughts. He had ridden for hours with little rest. More than once, doubt crept into his mind like the cold creeping through his bones. The fishermen had warned him. The elders had shaken their heads. Even the tea stall owner had spoken gently, as if preparing him for disappointment, but turning back felt impossible. As the light faded, he reached a cluster of low huts perched on slightly higher ground. Smoke rose weakly from one chimney, and a lantern glowed inside a doorway. He dismounted and approached, hoping for news. An old man wrapped in a wool shawl greeted him cautiously. "You have come far in this weather," the elder said. "I am searching for a young woman carried by the river last night," Hamza replied. "Have you seen anything downstream?" The old man's eyes softened with sympathy. "The river has been fierce," he said. We have stayed indoors, but this morning my grandson thought he saw something caught in the reeds beyond the bend. We could not reach it because the ground was too soft. Hamza felt a surge of renewed energy. Which direction, he asked. The old man raised a trembling hand and pointed toward a darker stretch of riverbank where thick reeds formed a tangled wall along the water's edge. Be careful, the elder added. The earth there can sink beneath your feet. Hamza thanked him and returned to his horse. The wind strengthened as he rode toward the bend, carrying the steady roar of water and the faint rustle of reeds brushing against one another. The sky darkened further, and a thin mist began to rise from the ground. Shapes blurred into shadow. He slowed his pace, knowing one misstep could send both horse and rider sliding into the flooded edge. When he reached the bend, he stopped and listened. The river's sound changed slightly here, its rush softening as the current curved around a shallow stretch. The reeds grew tall and dense, their long blades bending and clattering softly in the wind. He dismounted and tied the reins loosely to a low branch, allowing the horse to graze what little grass remained above the waterline. Then he stepped carefully toward the reeds, testing the ground before each step. Mud sucked at his sandals. The soil felt unstable, shifting beneath his weight. He moved slowly, steadying himself with a long branch he picked up from the ground. At first he saw only tangled vegetation and drifting debris lodged between stems, a broken basket, a cluster of waterlogged sticks, torn leaves plastered against the reeds. Then something caught his eye. A strip of blue fabric fluttered faintly in the damp breeze. He froze. The cloth was snagged on a cluster of reeds several meters from the bank, its color dull from mud and water but still visible against the brown current. It moved weakly, tugged by the slow pull of water. Hamza's pulse quickened. He stepped closer, scanning the area carefully. Beyond the cloth, partially hidden by branches and silt, lay a shape that did not belong to the river. For a moment fear rooted him in place. The storm, the exhaustion, the long hours of searching, everything seemed to press down on him at once. He forced himself forward. The water reached his ankles, icy and numbing. He waded carefully, gripping the branch for balance as the current tugged at his legs. Mud shifted beneath his feet, threatening to pull him off balance. As he pushed aside reeds and debris, the shape became clearer. A human form lay trapped against a cluster of branches lodged in the mud. Long dark hair, tangled with weeds, a shawl wrapped tightly around the body by the force of the current, one arm partially visible beneath the water. Aisha, he whispered, though he did not know if she could hear. He crouched and reached toward her shoulder. Her skin was cold, and for a terrifying moment he feared he had arrived too late. Then he felt it, faint but present, a pulse. Relief surged through him so suddenly it left him breathless. She was alive. Her breathing was shallow, barely visible against the rise and fall of her chest. The branches that trapped her had prevented the river from carrying her deeper into the current. Mud and reeds held her in place, both prison and protection. Hamza worked quickly but carefully, freeing the shawl and lifting the branches one by one. The water pressed against him as though resisting his effort. Twice his footing slipped and icy currents soaked his clothing, but he refused to let go. With great effort, he lifted her from the tangle and held her against his chest. She felt weightless and fragile, like someone who had drifted too long between worlds. He struggled back toward the bank, each step heavy against the pull of mud and water. When he finally reached solid ground, he laid her gently on a patch of damp grass. The wind blew strands of wet hair across her face. He brushed them aside and listened for her breath. It was faint, but steady. Night settled over the floodplain, bringing a deep, quiet darkness broken only by the endless rush of the river. There was no shelter nearby, no village lights within immediate reach. The air grew colder as the last traces of daylight vanished. Hamza looked around, knowing he could not move her far in her condition. She needed warmth. She needed protection from the wind. He gathered dry reeds and broken branches from beneath a rocky overhang a short distance away. Shielding a small flame with his hands, he struggled until the weak fire finally flickered to life. The fragile glow pushed back the darkness just enough to create a circle of warmth. He wrapped her in his shawl and sat beside her, feeding the small fire piece by piece. The river roared beyond the darkness, indifferent to the life it had nearly claimed. Hours passed in silence, broken only by wind and water. Hamza fought sleep, afraid the cold might steal the fragile warmth she had left. Sometime deep in the night, she stirred. A faint cough escaped her lips, followed by a shallow breath that trembled in the cold air. Hamza leaned closer, relief flooding through him. "You are safe," he said softly, though he did not know if she understood. Her eyelids fluttered, then closed again, as if she hovered between exhaustion and waking. Above them, clouds drifted slowly apart, revealing a few pale stars struggling through the thinning storm. And beside the restless river, Hope, fragile but alive, began to breathe again,